This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the coastal town of Palmdale, California, a small middle school nestled among a patchwork of new housing developments and fading strip malls served as the breeding ground for both unity and division. The streets outside buzzed with the sounds of everyday life, but within the confines of the school, something darker simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't the typical kind of darkness you could see or touch. It was the kind that crawled into your mind, distorted your thoughts, and twisted them into something unrecognizable. It was the kind of darkness that began with a single thought and grew into something far more dangerous. Lena had always been different from the other kids. She was an outcast, though she would never admit it to anyone, least of all herself. She had grown up in a house where the air felt thick with bitterness, a house where the only things that seemed to matter were the things that divided people. Her parents had taught her early on that there was a right way to live, a right way to think, and anyone who didn't fit into that mold was to be feared, despised, or simply ignored. She was raised to believe that her way of life, her beliefs were the only ones that mattered, and anyone who thought otherwise was beneath her. The world, to Lena, was divided into two categories: those who shared her views, and those who were to be destroyed, metaphorically, of course. At school, Lena had always been the one to stand apart from the other kids, not because she was shy, but because she was better. The others were too caught up in their friendships, their teams, their meaningless daily rituals. Lena was different. She was superior, or so she thought. The fact that most of her classmates didn't share her views only fueled her disdain for them. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They weren't like her. So she stood back and watched, a silent observer of the chaos around her, judging everyone and everything in sight. But then there was Imam. He came to the school one afternoon, his presence felt before it was even acknowledged. The moment he walked into the classroom, there was a sudden shift in the air, something palpable and chilling, like a sudden drop in temperature. He was different from the others too, but in a way that Lena could not yet comprehend. He wore a black hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, hiding his face like some kind of phantom. His presence was not just a physical one, it was a shadow that seemed to loom over everything he touched. It wasn't because he was shy or meek. No, it was something darker. It was the way his eyes scanned the room, the way his movement seemed calculated, deliberate. It was like he knew something no one else did. Lena couldn't understand why her gut twisted every time she saw him, but it did. She didn't want to feel that way. She told herself she was being ridiculous. After all, Imam was just another kid, just another person she had to tolerate. But that feeling, that sense of discomfort never left. There was something about him that made her skin crawl, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to gnaw at her from the inside. It wasn't just his silence, his calm demeanor. It was the way he didn't engage, the way he refused to fit into the little boxes she had assigned to everyone. He wasn't scared of her. He didn't need her approval. And that thought, that realization, filled her with a sense of dread that she couldn't explain. The kids at school didn't really know what to make of him either. He wasn't part of any group, didn't belong to any particular clique. He was just there. And in a place like this, that made him a target. It made him something to be dissected, judged, and perhaps, in Lena's case, hated. From the moment she laid eyes on him, something primal shifted inside her, a spark of rage that flared up like a wildfire, consuming every shred of rational thought. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong in her world. She didn't know why, but she could feel the creeping sense of danger, the growing realization that he represented everything she had been taught to fear. And so she did what anyone would do in her position: she ignored him. But the more she ignored him, the more she watched. The more she observed, the more she began to see things that she hadn't noticed before: subtle gestures, fleeting glances, whispers in the halls that felt like secrets just beyond her reach. It wasn't long before the whispers turned to something more overt. Small things at first. A brush of the shoulder in the hallway, a look that lingered a little too long. These things would have meant nothing to anyone else, but to Lena they were an invasion. She didn't know why he had to be so different. Why did he have to come into her world and challenge everything she believed? She had spent so much time building walls, erecting barriers around herself to keep out everything that didn't fit. And now here was this boy, a living, breathing symbol of everything she had been taught to reject. The fear Lena felt wasn't about the boy himself. No, it was something deeper, something more insidious. It was about losing control. It was about the fear that maybe, just maybe, everything she had been told about the world was a lie. and the fear that this boy, this stranger, would be the one to expose it. So she fought back. She fought back by pretending he didn't exist, by pushing him away before he had the chance to push back. But the harder she tried to ignore him, the more real the danger seemed. The walls she had spent so long building began to crack, and Lena had never felt more terrified in her life. Something was coming. Something terrible. And she wasn't sure if she could stop it. It was a rainy Monday morning when the spark ignited a seemingly ordinary day, but one that would set Lena's life on a path from which there would be no return. The clouds hung heavy, low over Palmdale, as though the skies themselves had grown weary of the tension that thickened in the air. Lena arrived at school early, her boots clicking sharply on the wet pavement, each step a defiant march toward the confines of the familiar, the safe. The rain had soaked her jacket, and her hair clung to the sides of her face, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere on the boy who had unsettled her since his arrival, the one whose very presence seemed to warp the space around him. Imam had been at the school for a week, and in that time Lena had come to despise him with a fervor she had never experienced before. It wasn't just the way he walked, silent and unwavering, like a shadow cast by something far more malevolent than a simple boy. It wasn't just his eyes, dark and unreadable, which seemed to pierce through the very walls of her thoughts. It wasn't even the way he held himself so calm, so unnervingly composed despite the subtle glances he received from others. No, it was something deeper, something Lena couldn't articulate, a feeling that crept under her skin and gnawed at her insides. He didn't belong. He was a disruption, an anomaly in her world, and every fiber of her being recoiled from that fact. Lena had always prided herself on her sense of control, her ability to see the world in black and white. There were the good people, her people, and then there was everyone else. It was simple, clean. The lines were drawn, and those who dared cross them were the enemy. Imam, with his strange foreign ways, was an enemy. And it didn't take long for Lena to decide that this foreigner, this symbol of everything she had been taught to reject, needed to be dealt with. Her first act of defiance had been small and unnoticed shove as she passed him in the hallway, her fingers brushing against his arm like a warning. But something about it had felt wrong, as though she had awakened something deep within herself, something she didn't want to confront. She could feel his gaze on her back as she walked away, his quiet stare a reminder that she was no longer the one in control. It was in the cafeteria that the hatred truly began to bloom. Imam sat alone at the far end of the room, his tray untouched, as if the whole world was too distant to matter. The other students avoided him, perhaps out of fear or indifference, but Lena wasn't satisfied with that. She couldn't stand that he remained untouched by the animosity she so desperately wanted to project. She couldn't stand that he didn't seem to care. She made her way to the table closest to him, deliberately loud with her friends, laughing, making sure he could hear every word, every mocking glance. She didn't know why she did it. It wasn't just about the boy anymore, it was about power, control, and the need to reassert dominance over a world that felt increasingly alien to her. And so, she pushed. She whispered just loudly enough for him to hear about the things that made him different, the way he wore his hoodie like a shield, the way he never smiled, the way his very presence seemed to draw attention to his otherness. The whispers spread, little threads of venom that began to wind around him, tightening with every passing day. The more Lena pushed, the more her resentment grew, until it was no longer just an instinctive loathing but a purposeful campaign. She whispered rumors to the other girls, telling them that Imam had strange beliefs, that he didn't even belong in their country. Her friends, eager to fit in and unwilling to question Lena's authority, echoed her words, making him the target of scorn. He became the object of every joke, the subject of every whispered insult. He wasn't just a boy anymore, he was the embodiment of everything Lena had been taught to despise. But the spark of hatred didn't end there. It wasn't just that she wanted to see him suffer, it was that she needed to see him suffer. She needed to break him, to force him to feel the same isolation, the same rejection that had always lingered at the edges of her life. She wanted him to understand that the world didn't have room for him, that it didn't matter how hard he tried to be quiet, to be invisible. In Lena's mind, Imam was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to her sense of order, and she would stop at nothing to ensure he knew his place. The next week, things took a darker turn. During gym class, Lena and her friends saw Imam walking alone toward the locker room, his eyes fixed on the ground. It was a moment of opportunity, one that Lena seized with a sense of perverse satisfaction. She made sure to walk past him, her shoulder purposefully brushing against his. She saw the flinch in his eyes, the brief flicker of hurt that passed over his face. But what Lena didn't expect was the sudden surge of anger that followed, a flood of rage so pure and hot it was almost tangible. For a moment she thought she could feel the heat of it in the pit of her stomach, a burning hatred that made her want to lash out, to destroy. In that instant, Lena realized something terrifying. She had become what she feared the most. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross. She had let the darkness inside her grow, feeding off her own bitterness, her own fear, and now she couldn't stop it. The whispers grew louder. The isolation became complete. Imam's presence, once a mere inconvenience, had turned into a living nightmare, a constant reminder of everything Lena had been taught to hate. She could see him in the hallways, his expression unreadable, and it made her skin crawl. But it wasn't just fear she felt anymore, it was something darker, something that made her blood run cold. She couldn't just ignore him. She couldn't just turn away. He was a symbol now, a living embodiment of everything she had been taught to fight against. And in that sickening moment, she realized she had become the monster she had always feared. The spark of hatred had taken root, and it was beginning to burn her from the inside out. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Lena had told herself that every time she saw Imam in the halls or caught sight of his shadow moving in the corners of her vision, she had rationalized her actions as part of the game, the way things had always worked. The stronger ones controlled the narrative, and the weaker ones were pushed aside. It was the way of the world. But now the world was starting to feel like a warped reflection, one that distorted every decision she made and every action she took. She had crossed the line long ago, and now the consequences were beginning to take form in ways she never expected. The school had grown quieter over the past few days, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of unspoken things. The chatter that once filled the hallways had become a mere hum in the background, faint and hollow, while the classrooms were filled with uneasy silence. Even the usual sense of order, the clamor of lockers slamming shut, the rush to class felt like a distant memory. It was as though something was wrong. Something was watching. Imam had stopped coming to class on time. He arrived later, sitting alone at the back of the room, his eyes never meeting anyone else's. It wasn't the typical quiet reserve anymore, it was something else, something much deeper, a retreat into himself that felt almost final. But Lena didn't know why it bothered her. She didn't care, right? She had spent so much time convincing herself that the hatred she had thrown at him was deserved, that she was justified in her actions. But with every passing day, her own certainty began to erode, like a dam slowly cracking under the pressure of a rising tide. She felt the weight of something dark pressing against her chest, something that began to smother her every thought. It was on a Thursday afternoon when everything shattered. The rain that had been lingering for days had finally broken, and the world outside was swallowed in a gray, oppressive fog. Inside the school, the atmosphere was no better. It felt suffocating, the tension palpable, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Lena could hear the murmurs of her friends, but they seemed distant, muffled, as if they were speaking to her from a different world. Her mind was elsewhere, drawn inexorably to the one thing she had been trying to ignore, the boy who had become the thorn in her side. As she sat in history class, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The air around her felt charged, heavy with an unknown threat. And then, as if on cue, Imam walked into the classroom, his footsteps barely audible on the linoleum floor. The moment he entered, everything seemed to freeze. The room, which had been filled with the hum of quiet conversation, became unnervingly still. His presence filled the space, not with force, but with an eerie, palpable calm that seemed to suffocate the room. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the class briefly, before settling on the desk at the back. There was no fear in him, no anger, only silence. Lena's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in days, she felt a pang of something that wasn't anger or disgust, but something far worse, guilt. It washed over her like a sudden tide, overwhelming her in an instant. She couldn't look away from him, couldn't shake the sensation that she had caused this isolation, this distance. But even as the guilt gnawed at her, there was another feeling that rose in its place, a sharp, gnawing fear. The bell rang, and the classroom erupted into its usual chaos, but Lena couldn't focus on anything except Imam. Her mind was locked onto him, her thoughts racing as she fought to suppress the unease that had begun to churn in her stomach. She tried to shake it off, to bury the unsettling feeling, but it wouldn't go away. It only intensified as the minutes stretched on, like an invisible weight growing heavier and heavier with each passing second. When class finally ended, Lena rushed to gather her things, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had settled around her. She hurried out of the classroom, but as she reached the door, She caught a glimpse of Imam's face, his dark eyes staring straight at her, unwavering. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and everything around her faded into the background. It was as if he could see through her, as if he knew exactly what she had done, exactly what she had caused. The thought was too much to bear. Lena spun on her heel and stormed out of the building, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't stand the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a suffocating force. But no matter how fast she walked, no matter how far she tried to run, she couldn't escape the feeling that followed her. The guilt was there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to drag her down. The schoolyard was empty, save for a few scattered students huddling under the eaves of the buildings to avoid the rain. Lena leaned against the wall, pressing her forehead to the cool brick, her mind racing. She had done this. She had pushed him too far, pushed him into a corner, and now she was paying the price. She had felt it in his gaze, that haunting, cold stare that seemed to pierce right through her. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was something more. Something that existed outside of her understanding, something that she couldn't control. And in that moment, Lena realized just how far she had fallen. She had become the monster she had feared, the embodiment of the hatred she had embraced. She had pushed Imam to the brink, and now she feared what might happen next. She feared that the darkness she had unleashed could never be undone. The pressure in her chest mounted, and her breath grew shallow as the weight of her actions crashed down on her all at once. There was no escape now. The breaking point had come, and Lena knew, deep in her bones, that it would change everything. The days that followed were a blur of unease. The weight of Lena's actions pressed down on her chest with every breath she took, suffocating her in a way she had never imagined possible. No longer able to escape the crushing reality of her own guilt, she wandered through the motions of school like a ghost, detached and numb. Her friends' laughter, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed distant, hollow, as though it belonged to someone else's life. Their words bounced off her without leaving any mark, and she could feel the walls she had spent so long building around herself crumble, piece by piece, with every passing moment. She couldn't look at Imam anymore. She couldn't even bear to be in the same room as him without her skin crawling, as if the weight of her wrongs was etched into the very air around him. Every time their paths crossed, something inside Lena twisted in a way that was both painful and unavoidable. She had pushed him too far. She had made him something more than a boy. She had turned him into a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life, the things she had feared, the things she had tried to repress. And now, as she watched him from a distance, she felt the hollow ache of a realization that she could not escape. She had become the villain in her own story. It wasn't long before the silence between them became deafening. The space between Lena and Imam, once filled with the soft hum of mockery and hatred, now felt as though it were charged with something darker. The air was thick with tension, so palpable that Lena could feel it in her very bones. Imam had withdrawn completely into himself, becoming almost a phantom, a shadow in the background of every moment, moving with a quiet grace that was almost unnatural. But Lena didn't find comfort in his silence. No, it terrified her. It was the absence of something that should have been there, the lack of response to the fire she had lit beneath him. His indifference had taken on a life of its own, and it was like a cold wind, freezing her in place whenever she thought about him. There was a dark curiosity that began to stir within her, a compulsion to understand the boy she had tormented, the boy she had forced into the very depths of himself. She tried to bury it, to ignore it, to tell herself that she didn't care. But the truth was undeniable. She needed to know what was inside his silence, what lay hidden behind those cold eyes that seemed to pierce through her whenever their gazes met. It was a question that clawed at her, gnawing away at the edges of her mind until it became an obsession. Why did he react so calmly to her cruelty? Why did he seem impervious to the pain she had tried to inflict? The weeks dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Lena's steps became sluggish, her mind constantly circling back to the same question: what would it take to break him? She knew it was wrong to think that way, to hope that some sort of reaction would justify her actions, but she couldn't stop. There was something inside her that demanded answers. The pressure mounted, and one afternoon, unable to bear it any longer, Lena found herself walking toward the courtyard. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythm that seemed too loud, too frantic for her own body. But she couldn't stop it. She had to see him. The courtyard was empty, save for the overgrown bushes and the lingering scent of rain that still clung to the air. It felt like an abandoned place, untouched by the chaos of the rest of the school. And there he was, sitting at the far edge of the courtyard, as always, alone. His face was turned slightly to the side, his hood pulled up over his head, casting his features in shadow. The faintest hint of vulnerability was hidden beneath the calm exterior, but it was there, lurking just below the surface. Lena felt the pull, the urge to move closer. It wasn't about hate anymore. It wasn't about pushing him further into the abyss. It was about understanding. It was about seeing past the layers she had built up around him, about peeling back the walls he had constructed and finding what lay inside. She moved toward him slowly, her feet dragging with the weight of her own fear, her own guilt. Her breath caught in her throat as she stopped a few feet away from him, her heart racing in her chest. It felt like the world had narrowed to this single moment, and there was nothing left to do but face the consequences of everything she had done. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. But that silence, that absence of reaction, only deepened the ache inside her. It was as though he were standing on the other side of a glass wall, unreachable, untouchable, and she had no way of knowing how to break through. In that moment, something inside Lena snapped. The facade of control she had maintained so carefully shattered, and for the first time she saw the boy not as a threat or a symbol of everything she hated, but as a person who had been hurt, just like her. She had pushed him. She had torn at him with words and gestures. And for what? To make herself feel powerful. To make herself feel safe in a world that she had convinced herself was hostile. And now, standing before him, she realized that the pain she had inflicted was nothing compared to the emptiness that lived inside her. For a brief, fleeting moment, Lena thought she saw a flicker of something in Imam's eyes, an almost imperceptible shift, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Lena with nothing but the crushing weight of her own self-awareness. She had been wrong. She had been so wrong. She turned and walked away without a word, her mind reeling, her heart heavy. The understanding had come too late. She had already done irreparable damage. But in that brief moment of clarity, as the world around her seemed to sharpen into focus, Lena knew something deep within herself had changed. She couldn't undo the harm she had caused, couldn't erase the pain she had inflicted, but she understood now that hate, once set in motion, could only feed on itself. It had consumed her, turned her into something she didn't recognize, and now it was too late to turn back. The path to understanding had led her to a place where there was no redemption, no simple solution. There was only the bitter taste of what she had lost, and the realization that the road to healing would be far longer than she ever imagined. It happened in the dead of night. The kind of night where the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Lena couldn't sleep, couldn't quiet the relentless barrage of thoughts that stormed her mind like thunder tearing through a storm-saturated sky. She had tried to convince herself that it would pass, that the guilt, the constant gnawing sensation of being consumed by something she could no longer control, would fade with time. But as each night dragged on, it became clear that this weight was not going to lift on its own. It was an anchor, dragging her deeper into a sea of confusion and regret. The room around her was dimly lit by the pale glow of her bedside lamp, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The silence of her home was deafening, and yet it only served to highlight the noise inside her own mind. Her own thoughts felt like a cacophony, dissonant and overwhelming. She had pushed him, had made him an object of hatred, and now she was staring into the abyss of her own making, wondering if there was any way to pull herself back from the brink. But she knew that there was no going back. She had gone too far, and it was too late for redemption. In the midst of her restless mind, there was a sound of faint scratching at the door. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her freeze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she thought it was just her imagination. But then the scratching came again, louder this time, more insistent. Lena's breath hitched in her chest, and she slowly rose from her bed, her legs trembling beneath her. There was a feeling, a chill that crawled up her spine, that told her she wasn't alone. She crept to the door, her hands shaking as she reached for the handle. For a split second, she considered turning away, going back to the safety of her bed and pretending that none of this was real. But she couldn't. She knew she couldn't. The confrontation, the reckoning that had been waiting for her for so long, had come. She opened the door. Standing there on the other side was Imam. His presence in the doorway was an unsettling juxtaposition, quiet, composed, almost surreal. He looked unchanged, like a figure trapped in the stillness of time, his dark eyes meeting hers with a haunting intensity. There was no anger in his expression, no visible sign of retaliation or violence. Instead, there was an unsettling calm that emanated from him, something that felt colder than any fury could ever be. Lena stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. It was as though the world around her had tilted on its axis, and the ground beneath her feet had become unstable. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her hatred was justified. And now here he was, standing in front of her, a manifestation of everything she had done. She had always thought of him as a shadow, an otherness to be defeated, an enemy to be pushed aside. But now he was real. He was here. And the truth was undeniable. She had created this moment. Imam's presence in the doorway was like a wall of ice, and Lena felt every inch of her control shatter under the weight of it. He wasn't the person she had imagined him to be. He wasn't the target of her hatred. He was a person, one who had been twisted and manipulated by the darkness Lena had nurtured inside herself. But even as the realization struck her like a blow to the chest, she couldn't bring herself to move. She stood there, frozen, as though awaiting something, anything, to shift the unbearable tension between them. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them spoke. The air around them was thick with the unspoken words, the things that could not be articulated. Every thought Lena had ever had about him, every piece of vitriol she had thrown in his direction, hung in the air like a weight, suffocating them both. And yet, Imam didn't move. He didn't make a sound. It was as if the silence between them had become a living thing, an entity that grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, it was Lena who broke the silence. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of everything she had kept inside for so long. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to meet his gaze. Instead, she focused on the floor, on the pattern of the carpet beneath her feet. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words barely leaving her lips, like a confession long buried. The apology felt hollow, empty, as though no amount of words could undo the damage she had caused. She didn't even know if he heard her. But somehow it didn't matter. She was past the point of hoping for forgiveness. She was past the point of anything except confronting the cold, undeniable truth that she had set this in motion. A long moment passed. The room felt colder, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in around them. Lena's breath was shallow, her heart racing, as she waited for something, anything to happen. She expected anger, maybe even violence. She expected him to lash out at her, to show her the depths of the hurt she had caused. But none of that came. Instead, Im remained silent, his gaze still fixed on her, unwavering. Then, something unexpected happened. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until he was just a few inches away from her. Lena's breath caught in her throat, her entire body tense with anticipation, but he didn't reach for her. He didn't strike. Instead, his eyes met hers, and in them, Lena saw something that made her blood run cold. There was no hatred, no anger. There was nothing but a deep, endless emptiness, a reflection of the void she had created inside him. For a long time she stood there, unable to move, trapped in the suffocating realization that this moment was the culmination of everything she had built, everything she had become. She had tried to break him, to make him feel less than human, and now she was standing on the precipice of her own destruction. The moment stretched, and in it, Lena saw the full weight of her own cruelty, the full horror of what she had done. She had broken him, but she had also broken herself. The silence between them stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, with a final quiet movement, Imam turned and walked away. His steps were silent, almost imperceptible, until the door closed softly behind him. And as the echo of his departure faded into the night, Lena was left standing in the darkness, alone with the consequences of her actions. The confrontation had ended, but the reflection had only just begun, and in that silence Lena understood. There was no redemption here, no forgiveness that could be offered. There was only the aftermath, the slow, relentless realization that some wounds, once inflicted, could never heal. The days after Imam's departure were filled with a stillness that suffocated Lena in a way she could not have anticipated. It was not just the silence that haunted her, though that alone seemed to echo endlessly through the walls of her room. No, it was the unrelenting presence of her own thoughts, dark, insidious thoughts that gnawed at her with a ferocity that felt impossible to escape. Each minute that passed dragged her deeper into a well of guilt and regret from which she feared there would be no escape. She had done it. She had driven him to the brink of something unspeakable, and in doing so, had destroyed herself in the process. There was no way for her to undo what she had done, no magic words that could take back the pain she had caused. The world outside her window seemed distant, as though it existed on another plane entirely, one that she could no longer touch. Her life had become a series of hazy, disconnected moments, where the shadows seemed to stretch and grow with each passing day. Even the smallest task felt monumental: getting out of bed, brushing her teeth, walking to school. Every action was a reminder of the weight of her guilt, the consequences of her cruelty. Lena had once believed that she could live her life above it all, that she could push people aside and treat them as she saw fit without consequence. She had made herself numb to the pain of others, closing her heart off like a fortress. But now, as the days bled into one another, she felt as though the walls she had so carefully built had collapsed, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Her own reflection in the mirror was a stranger to her now, a face she barely recognized, a girl who had once been so certain of her place in the world, but who had since lost her way in the fog of her own malice. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that Lena felt the first stirrings of something else, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't a solution, not exactly, but it was something that pulled at her, a whisper in the darkness. It began small, just the faintest spark of awareness, a recognition that she was not the person she had thought herself to be. It was as if, for the first time, she saw herself clearly. She saw the damage she had done, not just to Imam, but to herself. And in that clarity there was a kind of horror, but also the faintest glimmer of possibility. Could she change? Could she somehow fix the broken parts of herself, the parts that had driven her to such cruelty? It didn't come all at once. Redemption is rarely so clear, so simple. Instead, it arrived in fits and starts, moments of realization that seemed insignificant at the time, but which, in retrospect, were the beginning of something far more profound. At first, Lena simply started noticing the small things: the way she flinched when people looked at her, the way her stomach turned whenever someone spoke of Imam. She couldn't escape the guilt that clung to her like a second skin, but she started to see it differently. She stopped trying to drown it, to bury it deep inside her. Instead, she began to sit with it, to let it unfold around her like a heavy fog. The school day, once a source of anxiety and dread, became an arena for her to face herself. The faces of her classmates, who once seemed so distant and unfamiliar, now appeared as reflections of her own pain. They weren't just people. They were stories. They were lives, each one burdened by its own struggles, its own burdens. And in the midst of this, Lena began to realize the true cost of her actions, not just to Imam, but to herself. She had torn at the fabric of something far greater than herself. She had poisoned her own heart, her own sense of self. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the library, flipping idly through the pages of a book that she couldn't quite focus on, a thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. Perhaps the only way to move forward was to confront what she had done directly. It wasn't enough to feel guilty, to wallow in the darkness of her own mistakes. If she wanted to change, truly change, she needed to make amends. She needed to confront Imam, to face the very thing she had spent so long trying to avoid. The idea terrified her. Every part of her screamed to run away, to hide from the consequences of her actions. But the pull was undeniable. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't live in this half-life of regret and self-loathing. And so, with a trembling heart, she set out to find him. It wasn't easy. Imam had become a shadow in the halls, someone who seemed to drift in and out of the school unnoticed, as if the world had decided to forget him entirely. It felt like trying to catch a wisp of smoke, an impossible task. But Lena didn't give up. She searched for him for days, combing every corner of the school, the parks, the streets near their neighborhood. Each search brought with it a fresh wave of dread, as though the universe itself was trying to tell her that she had no right to seek him out, that she had no right to redemption. But she ignored it, pushing forward, driven by something stronger than fear. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation, no grand moment of revelation. It was simply a quiet meeting, one that felt like the meeting of two souls who had both been through hell and back, in different ways, but who were now standing at the crossroads of their own healing. Imam stood by the same tree in the park, his eyes distant, his expression unreadable, but there was something softer in his gaze, something that had not been there before. Lena took a hesitant step forward. She didn't know what to say, but the words came out anyway, awkward and uncertain. "I'm sorry," she said. The words seemed too small, too insignificant in the face of everything she had done. "I was wrong. I hurt you. I don't know how to make it right, but I need you to know that I regret it. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I was wrong to hate you. I didn't see you for who you were." The silence stretched between them, but this time it was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of guilt. It was the quiet of something new, something fragile, but full of possibility. Imam didn't respond right away. But his eyes softened, and for the first time Lena didn't feel like she was staring into the abyss. She wasn't sure what this meant, what would come of it. But in that moment, she knew something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it, acknowledging the harm that had been done, and then deciding to move forward, no matter how painful that process might be. As they stood there, in the cool evening air, Lena felt the first real stirrings of change deep inside her. She didn't know where this path would lead, or if it would even lead anywhere at all. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the past begin to lift, even just a little. And that was enough. She had started the journey to redemption, and that, she realized, was the most terrifying and beautiful thing of all.